My name was Adam Lancashire. From the moment of my conception, I'd had a feeling things were not going to work out for me in the long run. I had no idea how short my long run would turn out to be. There are scientific phrases and medical terms for my particular condition, but the main word that came to mind was unhappy. You can't believe everything you read unless others swear it's the truth, in which case you can never believe it. My story begins somewhere around the age of 22 in the sweaty little town of Ajo, Arizona. I say somewhere around that age because I never had a birth date. Every kid in the world got one, not me. I know what you're thinking. What does it say on your birth certificate? Nope, never had one of those either. I never knew exactly how old I was or wasn't. I've always had to ballpark it. I never had birthday parties either, but no friends to celebrate with. I'm not sure I missed out on much. Parties without friends can be depressing, I would imagine. And who needs that kind of funk fest? A cake, however, would have been nice. My story won't make much sense if you don't know the history of my family, and even then, it's a stretch. Just know that the Lancashire family tree was an abnormal growth with a system of twisted branches and a trunk that never quite took root. Our path was complicated, not a feel-good story by any means. My family was cursed by fate or God or whatever vindictive deity you might choose to believe in. More than cursed, we were disgraced, which is the worst kind of pain one can endure. It's been said there's no place like home. For me, that was very true, but not in the positive way. The phrase usually implies the town of Ajo is neither here nor there, but somewhere between both. It's a town on the border, a stopping place between the known and the new, the lost and the found, the US and Mexico. It's where I lived. By this point in my life, I lived alone. The townspeople's memory of my family's sordid past had evaporated into the dry desert heat like the rivers that once ran through this sun-baked town, or the copper mines that once brought men to work. There remained, however, one elderly Native American who'd been in town longer than anyone could remember. He knew of my family's legend, and he seemed to know a secret of mine. When he'd seen me in town, this ancient man, his skin lined and cracked like a discarded leather couch left out on the curb, would point and mumble, "Beware, crying owl, a storm is coming." In his ancient culture, the owl was seen as the bearer of bad news, and if an owl was crying, it meant really bad shit was on the horizon. At the time, these words made little sense, but his people had lost more than mine ever had. I figured he'd earn the right to have a laugh on me. My view on life was built upon the words my late father used to say to me at night while tucking me into bed. "Adam, we Lancashires are unlucky by nature. It's always been that way, and it's never going to change. Disappointment and suffering adorn our coat of arms. Bad luck is our family's crest. Learn to accept it, make peace with it, befriend it. Take it out for an occasional beer, and maybe, just maybe, misfortune will pass by your home like the angel of death passing by the blood-stained doors of those poor, haunted kids in Egypt." I'm not sure he got the Old Testament story correct, but in an odd way, I knew what Dad meant. Death was irrational and could visit anyone at any time. Best don't take it personally. Despite Dad's dark and dreary message, I did not live in fear, nor did I take his warning as a harbinger of doom. I accepted the simple words of a man who'd had his heart broken and was doing his best to keep mine from following suit. My dad, Eugene Lancashire, was somewhere around my age when he married Sylvia Langham, who he'd met at his job as a border patrolman on the US-Mexico border just 40-some miles south of Ajo. He'd taken the job so that he could keep watch out for his long-lost father, who disappeared into Mexico when Eugene was a boy. Dad enjoyed riding a horse while patrolling the long stretches of nothing and nobody in the barren desert. It was out in that empty land that he had come across Sylvia, who'd come south from her home in New Mexico to study various forms of cactus, a hobby of hers. What drew them together, I'll probably never know, but he thought he'd found a keeper as soon they had a son. Unfortunately, Sylvia wasn't one to be kept. Her pregnancy with me was unexpected, and not long after, she left my father for another woman. I never knew my mother. I was told she'd suffered from extreme depression and we'd never bonded. She was the reason I never had a birth date. When she left us, so went any information about my earliest beginning. The whole thing was too painful for my father to deal with, so I never asked him about it. As far as I'm concerned, birthdays are overrated. My dad did tell me that Sylvia and her lover moved up to Taos, New Mexico, where they sold cacti and cactus-scented candles to tourists. I never looked for her because I never wanted to find her, and I was sure the feeling was mutual. It's not surprising that I developed an intense loathing of cacti and cactus-scented products. My father patrolled the border for the next 12 years, saving money in his 401k fund with the intention of moving me and himself to a shady, much cooler climate upon his retirement. He spent little of his money on frivolous things, mostly only what we needed to live. It was all about the future for this hardworking man, and I learned some important lessons from him. Number 1, the future is bullshit. That hard-earned nest egg my father had saved up was drained in a matter of well-documented hours when the market crashed in 2008. He lost everything. How he was able to go to work during those following months, knowing there would be no retirement or shady place to live out the rest of his days, is a mystery to me. He worked for 10 more years on the border until he died of sunstroke in the sweat-soaked winter of his discontent. Lesson number 2 that I learned from him. Life is hard, and then you die. I'd actually read this on a t-shirt years earlier, but it never really hit me until he passed on. Instead of bemoaning my family's age-old curse of bad luck, I chose to follow my father's word of advice and brace it. I didn't have much, but I had a cat to keep me company. I would have preferred a dog, but I couldn't imagine raising a dog in a town this hot, so I got a black cat who is missing her tail, and I named her Misfortune. Hell, if she was lucky enough to escape whatever wild animal nearly ended her, she qualified as fortunate in my book. As far as getting out of this town, I wanted to move, and I almost made it. I went to college for a few semesters, but the University of Arizona doesn't come cheap. I borrowed money from Sally Mae, and man, did she turn out to be a bitch. I watched my debt rapidly increase like a gas pump filling up a Winnebago. I suppose I should have stuck it out, but after my guidance counselor told me that teachers don't make enough to pay off student loans, I dropped out and began the immediate task of working for the man. In hindsight, this was also not a wise move because the only job I could find, working at the last tanning salon in the West, barely paid me enough to survive. I would have quit, but I was pretty certain the place was a front for the Mexican mafia, and I'd heard once you were in, you could never get out. This was the same reason I never asked for a raise. I made the bare minimum payments to keep from defaulting on my loans, but I was occasionally late and the interest was compounding daily. Up to this point in my life, other than my mother leaving, nothing interesting had ever happened to me. School had been okay, if for no other reason than we had air conditioners in most classrooms. Our teachers weren't the greatest. No one dreams of moving to Ahu to teach, but there were a few decent instructors along my journey and I appreciated the efforts they made to get me to my minimum wage paying job. History was my favorite subject, but my father always told me there was no future in history. So I tried to find other subjects I might enjoy. I'd always wanted to try a book, and I kept journals, but all I knew about was life in Aho. And who's bored enough to read about life in Aho? Just thinking about it made me sleepy, and sleeping was something I found myself doing more often. Maybe I was depressed, I didn't know, but I could not find the energy or the interest to do much of anything. We had one movie theater in town, but it played movies that had been out for a few years, often starring Steven Seagal. No thank you. The theater had air conditioning, however, and with mine perpetually broken, an occasional double feature would provide a few hours of quality slumber for Misfortune and me. On this particular morning, there would be no movie on account of my job. I made my way to the shower, which was a short 6 or 7 steps across my shoebox of an apartment, knowing I would be covered in sweat the moment I got out, but at least I'd have soft and wavy hair. Pert Plus, all-in-one shampoo and conditioner, might have been a quarter more than the bargain brand, but there were some things I would not skimp on. I donned my best pair of khakis, Gap outlet store, I'm fairly certain one pant leg was longer than the other, along with my required work t-shirt which I had yet to be reimbursed for purchasing, and gave Misfortune an apology for the heat. Then I gave her a kiss on the nose, and in turn she gave me a quick swipe from her claw to my bottom lip, which drew blood. I deserved it, but what kind of man raises an animal in such conditions? I grabbed the towel from my nightstand and dabbed my lip. The previous bloodstains from my coughing fit during the night had dried into dark crust, and it wasn't lost on me that these crimson blotches had grown more prevalent in the past few weeks. I'd considered having it checked out, but with no health insurance, that wasn't an option. I hoped it wasn't strep throat, which can be a real pisser. I grabbed 2 oven mitts on my way out the front door. Global warming was heating life up, especially in Aho, and getting into cars was like sliding into an oven. The mitts helped prevent blisters for the steering wheel. Although I had no driver's license, I didn't have far to go in my dad's old Toyota, which was on its last leg. Years of intense sun had bleached the colour from the exterior of the car, as well as cracked the dashboard and ruined the seat covers, which was most common in most cars in town. But it got me to the mile to work and then back home. I did my best to stay awake at the tanning salon, but having no customers made it difficult. It was a small building with few rooms that were always empty, and often I felt more like a house sitter with nothing to do. I'd often walk next door to and visit Sarah, my one and only friend in town, who worked at the Here Goes Nothing travel agency. That business was equally slow, because anyone could book their own travel online, and because Here Goes Nothing is a terrible name for a travel agency. I was certainly no marketing whiz, but Here Goes Something, or Here We Go, would make much better sense. Sarah mentioned it to the owner, who was Bulgarian and unfamiliar with American phrases and idioms. The owner refused to change the name, saying he would have to reprint business cards and didn't want the hassle. I was fairly certain his shop was also a front for the Russian mafia. I can't recall the moment I became aware of Sarah, nor can I remember a time before she came into my life. It's like she was always there. Unlike me, she was smart and optimistic, and she had a great sense of humor, a rare trait in the bitter town of Aho. Although the same age as me, Sarah was definitely more mature. She'd taken a few classes online in public relations and was applying to PR firms in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, but wasn't having much luck. In the meantime, she was trying to save money while working at the travel agency. Unfortunately, working on commission with no customers to speak of, there wasn't much to save. Most men would have considered Sarah a catch, but as was the case with most great women, she was also into other great women, and who could blame her? The thing I liked most about Sarah, even more than her short strawberry blonde hair and her delightful freckles that bloomed whenever she forgot to wear sunscreen, was her independent spirit. I related to her more than I related to anyone else. More than that, I identified with her. I wanted to be her. That's how much I admired my best friend. Although it might have taken her some time to admit her truth to others, she had always known who she was, and that's more than I can say about myself. It was probably the fact that we could never date each other that allowed me and Sarah to become so close. More than friends, it was like we were one and the same. We considered ourselves a part of the invisible generation, kids who'd been on our own since the moment of conception. Mistakes, some might call us. We had no defining history to look back upon, and not much of a future to look forward to. Whatever reality might await us would be up to us to create. I dreaded the day that Sarah would get her act together and make a move out of our stupid little town, even though that was exactly what I had hoped for her. She deserved to find a life and a lover, a career, and a home of her own. After all, she wasn't the one who was jinxed. I was. She was merely forgotten, and compared to me, that wasn't so bad.